All right, let's get started here. Let's say a quick prayer, please. Our most gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this time that we have to come together and learn more from your word, and we ask that you be with us this morning, and may we take these words to heart and learn to be more like you. These things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, if you remember, by the way, we're going to have to do this old school today. For some reason, my thumb drive didn't work, so there are no slides. So you'll just have to listen to me today, I guess, instead of look at the pictures. So if you remember, back in Acts chapter 23, we saw that Paul had been in Jerusalem, and he had been arrested as a riot was about to break out in the temple courts. And then he had made 2 unsuccessful attempts to try to placate the Jews and to testify to them about Jesus Christ. And now slide 3. All right, so that was a joke, by the way. They refused to listen, of course, and then what happened? What happened with the 40 men that were in Jerusalem? Remember? They took a what? A what? An oath or a vow, and they weren't going to do what? Until they killed Paul. That's right. And so these 40 men had taken a vow not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. The nephew of Paul heard of this and told the governor, or not the governor, but the tribune, and he assembled 470 men to take one lone Christian from Jerusalem up to Caesarea, where the governor was at this time. And that's where we're going to pick up today, when Paul faces the governor by the name of Felix. Now, Felix was the successor to Pilate. Anybody remember the name Pilate? Pontius Pilate? What's he known for? He washed his hands. He was very clean. He was very hygienic. Yes. A bad decision. Okay, yeah. I think we're all alluding to the same thing here. This was the man who sent Jesus, and refused to release him, right? And sent him on to be tried and then crucified. So Felix was his successor, and Felix took over the role sometime around 52 AD, and we know something about him from secular history. He had been governor of the province of Judea about 5 years by the time Paul is brought before him, and he had previously lived for about 2 years in the city of Samaria. So he knew something about the Jews and about their nation. Now, he had been born a slave, but his brother, Pallas, somehow happened to become a favorite of the Roman Emperor Claudius. And through the influence of his brother Pallas, Felix had been appointed to the governor of this province. And this is the first time that we know of that a slave had become a governor of a Roman province. Now, he had been married 3 times by the time Paul comes before him. The first one was, we really know nothing about except that she was a princess. His second wife was the granddaughter of Antony and Cleopatra, which I think most of us have at least heard of. And then his third wife appears with him in this account. Her name was Drusilla, and she was Jewish, and she was the daughter of Herod Agrippa, who, if you look back earlier in Acts, I think 11, 12, somewhere in there, that this is the King Agrippa that had the Apostle James put to death. All right, so she's his daughter. Now, Drusilla had been the wife of the king of Emsera, but Felix had seduced her, and now she was living with him as his wife. If you can't tell from this account, this man was completely unscrupulous. He was known to hire thugs to eliminate even friends who happened to get in the way of his political ambitions. And his whole rule over this province of Judea was marked by unrest and dissatisfaction by pretty much everyone. In fact, it grew to the point that that would eventually lead to the revolt. The policies he's put in place and the way he enforced them would eventually lead to a revolt in AD 66, which would then lead to the destruction of the temple by the Romans in AD 70. So, not a great governor. However, before that, he was recalled to Rome in about AD 59 or AD 60. He was recalled to Rome, and we'll talk about that at the end of the lesson, about his harsh methods and his inability to maintain tranquility and peace in his province. So the first 9 verses of chapter 24 set forth the charges. So if you remember, like I said, the tribune sent 470 men to take this one Jew to Caesarea, and he is brought before Felix, the governor there. And also that came down from Jerusalem were some members of the Sanhedrin, and probably this delegation included both Pharisees and Sadducees, all right? And then they're going to have a trial of Paul. So Paul's brought before Felix, and it says starting in verse 1 of chapter 24, if you want to read along with me, it says, "And after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and a spokesman, one Tertullus. They laid before the governor their case against Paul. And when he had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him." All right? So Luke, I think, is careful to record that the high priest himself is there. Why do you think the high priest made that journey? You know, I think we said it's about a 60-mile journey from Jerusalem to Caesarea. So not an easy journey, 60 miles each way. But I think so. I think he had a personal interest in it. And yeah, he wanted to make sure that things went the way he wanted it to. Now, what had Paul done to him? Remember last week what happened when Paul came before the Sanhedrin? He had insulted him, hadn't he? He basically called, instead of addressing him properly, in fact, insulted him to the point that the high priest told the guy standing next to him, slap him across the face, which he did, you know. So he was obviously offended by this. So he makes the trip from Jerusalem to Caesarea, and he brings a lawyer with him and some of the others, and they make their case against Paul. And then continuing in verse 2, it says, saying, "Since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation, in every way and everywhere we accept this with all gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly." So what is Tertullus doing here? Tertullus, by the way, means, we think, or commentators think, that this man was very short, because Tertullus is the diminutive of Tertius, okay? So they think that he was given the name of Tertullus. Excuse me. Got a nose tickle. Excuse me. Yes. Yes.
This area, so he's gone just the opposite. Say, "Hey, you're doing such a great job."
Exactly. Yeah. And they both know this is a lie, right? You know, this is just bold-faced flattery out here, right? He says, "We've enjoyed much peace." Not true. "With your foresight," not true. "Reforms are being made," not true. So these are all lies, and they both know it. And I think at some point Felix kind of gives him the dead eye or the fish eye or something, and because he says, "Okay, I'm not going to detain you any further, and I beg your kindness to hear this briefly," okay? He says, "For we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world, and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him about everything of which we accuse him." The Jews also joined in this charge, affirming that all of these things were so. So let's break this down a little bit. I don't know if Luke has given us everything that was said, but it's enough to understand the charges that were leveled against Paul. And I think these charges are in particular designed to interest a Roman governor. Because what were the Romans most interested in their empire, other than conquest and money? Exactly. Maintaining the peace, all right? If you control an empire, a far-flung empire like they had, with many different people, many different nations, many different religions, many different customs, what's the one thing that you want to have the most of? Peace, all right? You can't have unrest all over the place and maintain the empire. So it was very important for the Romans. This was one of their top priorities. And as you remember, that's one of the reasons Felix was recalled in the end, was because he could not maintain the peace in Judea. And so he was recalled to Rome. Excuse me. So what are the charges against Paul here? Well, first, it says he is a revolutionary troublemaker, stirring up difficulties and riots throughout all the empire. Okay? And second, he was labeled a religious radical, a ringleader of a sect called the Nazarenes. And of course, Felix, having been governor, had heard of the Nazarenes, and furthermore, he knew that there were a lot of false messiahs around that were ready to ignite this nation. And we had talked about one last week, the Egyptian, who raised 4,000 men and went out and told these 4,000 zealots that he could drop the walls of Jerusalem at his command, and so they all went out to the Mount of Olives. He spoke the command, and of course nothing happened, except that the Romans came out and slaughtered all of them. Not all of them, but most of them. But the Egyptian got away. In fact, if you remember, that's why, that's who that the tribune thought Paul was initially. That was the reason that he thought that there was such a riot in the temple. It was that the tribune thought that Paul was this Egyptian that had caused such an uprising, okay? So if you're a Roman governor, you know, this charge is very serious. If he's fomenting revolution throughout this area, then that's a very serious charge, okay? And then third, the third charge is that Paul was a sacrilegious fanatic who had tried to profane the temple. And again, this goes to the peace aspect of it. You know, if Felix had been in Judea for a long time, he knew how revered the temple was. He knew how the Jews felt about the temple. And so this charge that he was sacrilegious and trying to profane the temple was very serious, because that would, again, cause a disturbance of the peace, okay? So all of these charges were designed particularly to be of tense concern to the Roman administration. And yet, as we know, there's not a word of truth in any of them. The Jews who came along simply affirmed this without providing any evidence. And now in verse 10 through 21, Luke gives us Paul's defense. So starting in verse 10, it says, "And when the governor had nodded to him to speak, Paul replied, 'Knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense.'" All right, so does Paul try to flatter Felix up here, you know? I don't see any of the flowery words that the lawyer used. And in fact, he says the only thing nice, I think, that you can say about someone like Felix. He says, all right, I know you've been the governor here a long time. He didn't address whether he was a good governor, a bad governor, any of the things he had done, but at least he acknowledged that he'd been, you know, it was an honest statement. You've been the governor here for a long time. Okay, so he answers these charges one by one, and the first was that he was a revolutionary troublemaker. And to that he replies in verse 11, "You can verify that it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem, and they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. Neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me." Okay? And so he says, basically, it's just not true. He says, I've only been here 12 days. I haven't had time to incite a riot, and no one can prove what they're saying. He says, I didn't cause any problems in the temple. I didn't cause any problems in the synagogue. Who ran the temple, by the way? Which sect of Judaism ran the temple? The Sadducees. That's absolutely right. But who ran the synagogues? The Pharisees. Okay? The Pharisees ran the synagogues. Those were primarily places of learning. And who were the most learned men in Judea? the Pharisees. And so we see this dichotomy. There's already a friction between these two sects, not only because of what they believe, but also where they're based. And why were the Sadducees the ones in power running the temple? Because they were the only ones who would make a deal with Romans, okay? They didn't believe in an afterlife. They thought, there was no resurrection of the dead, there was no afterlife, there were no spirits, and the only thing that mattered is what you did here. And that led them to believe that being in power with the Romans was better than not being in power with the Romans, okay? So they made a deal with the Romans, and it was the Romans who basically appointed the high priest. And so you have this friction between the two religious sections of the country. You have the Sadducees who ran the temple. You have the Pharisees who ran the, word has just left me, the synagogues, thank you. And the Pharisees would never have made a deal with the Romans. And so they would never going to be in charge of the temple. And the Sadducees would never have been accepted in the synagogues because they didn't believe what most of the people in Jerusalem or in the Judea believed about the resurrection, okay? So there's this friction here already. But Paul says, I didn't cause any problems anywhere. I didn't cause any problems in the temple run by the Sadducees. I didn't cause any problems in the synagogues run by the Pharisees. I didn't even cause any problems anywhere else in the city. So this charge is totally false, okay? So the second charge, he says in verse 14, he admits to the second charge. He says, but this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by law and written to the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection both of the just and the unjust. So I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and men. All right? So he pleads guilty to the second charge. He says, I want to point out that I am indeed a follower of the way. And even though they call it a sect, I still believe in the law and the prophets, just as the men before you standing here do. All right? So he says, there's no problem with that, is there? It's not against the law to be, at this point anyway, it's not against the law to be a Christian, right? He can be a follower of the way and be a Jew and still be okay in Rome's eyes. And so he says, okay, I confess to that. It's true. But so what? There's nothing there. And third, he says, this results in a good life. He says, I have lived in all good conscience before God and men. And I live just as these men do, in belief of the resurrection and in the belief of the law. And that leads me to living a life that is acceptable before God and men, okay? All right, and then the third charge was that of profaning the temple. And to this, he replies in verse 17. He says, now after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. While I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple, without any crowd or tumult. And some Jews from Asia, they ought to be here before you and to make an accusation, should they have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the council. Other than this one thing, that I cried out while standing among them, it is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you this day. Okay? So he's packed a lot into this verse. Okay, so what was Paul's primary purpose for coming to Jerusalem? We looked over the last 2 or 3 chapters that Paul had this great desire to come to Jerusalem. Okay, why did he want to come to Jerusalem?
Wasn't there two things going on? One was deliver the offerings that the other churches put together for those in Jerusalem?
Yes, I think that's a secondary purpose. As he mentions here in verse 17, he has an offering that he's collected from the Gentile churches, because if you remember, there's a famine going on at this period in Jerusalem, and some of the saints are actually starving. So he collects alms, he collects money from the Gentile churches who are not doing badly, and he brings it with him to help the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. That was his secondary purpose. But his primary purpose, if you remember, was he had this great desire to teach Jesus Christ to the Jews in Jerusalem. All right? I think that was always in his heart. Even after his conversion, we read about how, he had been converted on the road to Damascus. He went away to Arabia for 2 or 3 years. He came back to Damascus, and he wanted to go to Jerusalem. He went to Jerusalem. They wouldn't accept him there. And he actually had to escape because of the plot against him. And so, and then finally, the Lord gave him this mission to go to the Gentiles. But it was always in his heart, I think, to teach the Jews about Jesus. And so that was his primary mission here. He wanted to teach the Jews about Jesus. Secondarily, he had also brought these offerings from the others. And so that's what he says here. He says, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. And while I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple. Okay, how was he purified? He was purified by water. Okay, I had a great slide of it's called a mikvah, which is basically a pool large enough for someone to be immersed in. And people who came from outside Judea, if they came for a feast or a festival or whatever it was, people outside Judea would have to come early, a couple days early. They would have to go through this ritual cleansing, and then they would have to wait a day or two, and then they'd have to be certified by the rabbi as being pure, okay? And they had to do that every time they came. Now, the Jews inside Judea did not have to do that. They had to be ritually clean, but they didn't have to wait several days, and they didn't have to get certified by the rabbi. And why did people from outside that area have to do that? Why did they have to go through this extra thing to become purified? Because they'd been near Gentiles. Yeah, that was the only reason. Just the mere proximity of Gentiles rendered them unclean. Okay? So if you had been traveling through Greece, Macedonia, Asia Minor, Cilicia, where Paul was born, any of those areas, you had to get to Jerusalem, and you were going to go to Jerusalem like he was wanting to be there for the Passover or for Pentecost. You had to arrive a couple days early because there were lots of people there. They had to be purified. They had to be certified, kosher, basically. And so that's what Paul is saying here. He says, I had done that. I had come here. I had been purified. I had been certified. And therefore, this charge against me is just ludicrous, all right? And he says, I do admit to one thing. In verses, look down in verse 21. He says, I have been blameless. I have done nothing wrong with these people except for one thing. I cried out, what? With respect to the resurrection of the dead, that I am on trial for you this day. He says he was a believer in the resurrection of the dead. Okay? And again, we said who was mainly the Sanhedrin, the rulers of the temple? The Sadducees, who did not believe in the resurrection, and so this was offensive to them. Okay? So in verse 18, Paul points out that he did not defile the temple. He had purified himself, and he refutes all of these charges that are laid against him. Okay? And then finally, he sums it all up and says, the most I have done, the very most that can be charged against me, is that when I stood in the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, I said something that divided them, that caused an argument among themselves, okay? So he has completely refuted all of these charges against him, okay? Now, let's look down at verse 22. But Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, When Lysias, the tribune, comes down, I will decide your case. Then he gave orders to the centurion that he should be kept in custody, but have some liberty, and that none of his friends should be prevented from attending to his needs. Okay? So Felix hears the case of the Sanhedrin against Paul. He hears Paul's defense. And it's interesting, I think. It says he has a rather accurate knowledge of the way. Why do you think he has an accurate knowledge of the way? That's part of it. I think you're absolutely right. We mentioned earlier his wife, Drusilla, was Jewish, and so that's part of it. And I think it's just he's keeping an ear to the ground. Here's this new sect of people. In the past, when these new sects have come out, they have generally been revolutionary. We talked about the assassins a couple of weeks ago. We talked about the Egyptian who raised 4,000 men. So whenever a new faction came out, it behooved the Roman authorities to keep an eye on it, to learn more about them. But so he had a fairly accurate, it says here, he had a very accurate knowledge of the way. Okay? But instead of deciding the case, what does he do? He stalls, right? He hesitates. He stalls. He says, when Lysias, who was Lysias? Anybody remember? He was the tribune in Jerusalem, remember? Okay, Lysias was the head of the Roman garrison in Jerusalem. They were stationed at the Antonia fortress, which was on the northwest corner of the temple. It had direct access to the temple. And he was in charge of anywhere between, 4,000 and 8,000 men. So pretty high-ranking military official. And if you remember, what had Lysias sent along with Paul to Felix? Mm-hmm.
That's right.
He sent him a letter. It says, I don't really know who this guy is, but I can't find any fault with him. He's done nothing here, either in writing or in deed, that would cause him to be imprisoned. So as far as I'm concerned, you can let him go. So Felix already has this letter from Lysias, and he's saying, you can let him go as far as I'm concerned. He hasn't done anything. But instead, Felix decides to delay the case and wait. Okay? And so he puts Paul in prison, and he's going to end up staying there for at least 2 years. And then next chapter, we're going to look at how he appeals to go to Rome and his time in Rome. But I think there's some lessons for us here. One of them is simply that when we disobey God and are later forgiven, as Paul has been forgiven and restored, that forgiveness does not change the pathway we have chosen. All right, you remember that I said that Paul's desire was to go to Jerusalem to preach to the Jews. What was the Spirit's desire for Paul? Not to go to Jerusalem, okay? And he was warned several times, but he went instead, and now he's in chains. And then Jesus came to Paul in prison. We saw that last week. And he told him, you're useful to me right where you're at. He says, you've got a job to do. Get up and be encouraged about this. He says, I know this is not what you wanted, but I've got a plan for you. And I've got a job for you. And so he restored him. And I think we need to understand that, is that even when things don't go our way, we can find a way to be God's ambassador here on earth, even if it doesn't look like what we wanted it to look like. All right? Paul was always looking for opportunities to teach about Jesus. He taught about Jesus in the courtyard when it caused a riot. He talked about Jesus on the steps of the courtyard, caused another riot. He talked about Jesus when he was addressing the Sanhedrin, caused another riot. All right? It didn't matter. He had a job. He wanted to preach about Jesus. And that's the point for us, I think. His imprisonment was not going to be comfortable, but it wasn't going to be probably as bad as some of the other places he had already been, such as Philippi. Okay? We would probably call it house arrest, right? He was probably staying in a house somewhere. he had the ability to receive visitors. They could bring him gifts. They could bring him necessities. And so it wasn't too bad. He could move around a little bit, okay? And then down in verse 24, it says, after some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ. And as he reasoned about the righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you. At the same time, he hoped for money would be given him by Paul. So he sent for him often and conversed with him. Who has I'm reading out of the ESV, who has a different version? Maybe the King James or NIV? Anybody have a different version? Where it says, Felix was alarmed and said, no, wait a minute. Yeah, Felix was alarmed. My version has alarmed. What does yours have? That's in verse 25. Afraid? I think the King James Version has trembled. Okay? Anybody ever heard that? And Felix trembled. How many sermons have you heard about this verse? Any ideas? You know, growing up in the church, we even sing a song about it, right? I think that song, what song am I talking about? Almost Persuaded, right? Is based on this verse right here. I am almost persuaded, right? So Felix calls Paul, and he's got his wife Drusilla there, and he spoke more about the Christian faith. And what did he speak to him about? He spoke to him about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment. Okay, and these things had a profound effect. The word here for righteousness is the Greek New Testament word for righteousness primarily describes conduct in relations to others, especially with regards to the rights of others in business, in legal matters, and based on the relationship to God, okay? Why do you think that would scare Felix? Because he wasn't very good at these things, was he? No. He'd probably had people murdered. He'd probably cheated people. He took bribes. He did all of these things. And so when Paul starts to talk about righteousness in dealing with God and in dealing with others, it probably scared him a little bit. Then he went on to talk about self-control. And the word here only appears one other time in Paul's letters, and it's in the listing of the fruit of the spirits in Galatians chapter 5. If the Holy Spirit is in us, then he is producing the life of Christ in us, and we will be characterized by love and joy and peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, and self-control. These things are given to us by the Spirit. And that's the word that's used here. And then finally, Paul tells him about the judgment to come. There is a time coming when every life is going to be evaluated, when each human being, without exception, will suddenly find himself standing before God with all his life laid out for everyone to see. Jesus spoke about this. He said that there will come a time when that which is spoken in secret will be shouted from the housetops, and that which is hidden shall be revealed. All the hidden secrets of the heart and everything done in secret will be openly displayed. And I can see now, and I think you can see now why Felix trembled, why he was afraid, why he was alarmed. These things strike at his very being. Paul has gone from preaching here to meddling. That's the old joke about preachers, right? And he's talking directly to what he can see in Felix's life, and it scares him to death. But unfortunately, it doesn't work. It's so easy to talk to one another of righteousness and holiness and the end of days in theory. But when it gets right down to it, the changes we must make, the duties and obligations that we bear as believers, and the consequences of our faith, then we're not so sure. Some people are not so sure they want to hear it anymore. It's a bit too personal. You know, if you think about this, Felix had an unequaled opportunity. He had probably one of the greatest religious minds, spiritual minds in captivity. He called, it says here, that he pulled him out of prison multiple times to talk to him about these things. And so he spent hours with the Apostle Paul to hear the clarity of his revelation of the nature of God and to understand the provision God has made to meet it, to understand what the truth is about Jesus Christ. I don't know anyone else, any other Gentile that had that opportunity for several years probably to talk to Paul about these things. But he passed it by. He turned his back and walked away. He says, go away until I have a more convenient season, a better opportunity. I don't know of anything sadder or more pathetic than these words. Even though he called Paul and talked to him often, he never trembled again. It's never mentioned again in this book. He had missed his opportunity. Okay, now, let's talk about the last part of verse 26. He says, Felix also had an ulterior motive, didn't he? He did want to, I believe truly, that he did want to learn more about Jesus Christ, about the way, and it did affect him because it scared him, I think, and he trembled. But he also had another motive. What does it say here in the last part of that verse? What was he hoping for? A bribe, exactly right. So the old Felix is still there, you know. The old Felix is still there. And, you know, today, a bribe is an illegal or shady, under-the-table type of thing. But back then, a bribe was pretty much customary, you know. If you wanted to win a court case or, I know in the Old Testament it talks about, you know, the corruption of bribery and all that kind of stuff. But in the Roman world, a bribe was fairly common. And if you wanted to win your case, if you wanted to prevail in a dispute, you made sure your bribe was bigger than the other guy's bribe. Okay? So this is not really unusual. And I think Felix was hoping Paul would raise a good amount of money and offer it to Felix in order to let him go free. And I think Paul knew that. I think Paul knew that he was expecting a bribe. So why didn't Paul do it? Paul had enough friends in Jerusalem. The church could have raised enough money. He brought money from the Gentile churches with him. He probably could have raised enough money to bribe Felix to let him go. Why didn't he? Yes. That's right.
Like, I guess I need to stay.
I think that is one reason. Absolutely. Sure.
It says that he was there for 2 years. I guess he was there during the whole time until Felix was replaced. That's the way. So, do you think Felix kept him there to keep him out of the way, so he wouldn't be going out? You know, to let somebody just be there for 2 years. I'm trying to think what Felix's motive would have been.
Well, first, I don't think that was unusual in those times. You know, he was imprisoned, and Felix had unlimited authority over him. So I don't think 2 years was an unusual, you know, in our eyes it is. But back then, I don't think that was too unusual. Second reason is, like you said, I think Felix did want to talk to him about it more. And then the third reason, I believe, is that he wanted to placate the Jews. If he kept Paul in prison, that would keep the Jews happy. And getting in this time period, he was all about keeping the Jews happy, all right? He needed some support. Yes, sir.
Why didn't he try to bribe him? It would have reduced him to like everyone else.
Absolutely.
He wouldn't stand out as who he was really meant to be.
Absolutely.
God's messenger.
So that's absolutely true. What was Paul's ultimate goal? Okay, he wanted to preach to the Jews in Jerusalem, but then he also mentioned another goal. What was his other goal? And Jesus told him this when he was in prison. He says, you're going to preach, you're going to be in chains, but you're going to preach to Rome. All right? Paul wanted to go to Rome. So he would never have given Felix a bribe. Okay? So there was no, and then in verse 27, as Dick mentioned, it says, when 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. Okay? There's absolutely no legal reason for this delay, only political. Felix desired to do the Jews a favor, but it wasn't because of his love for them. Rather, as history tells us, he went too far. Felix, this is Felix, he went too far once too often. We know from other records that at about this time there was a clash in Caesarea, right where he was at, where Paul was in jail, between the Jews and the Greeks that lived there over the question of whether Caesarea was a Jewish city or a Greek city. The Jews won. Felix didn't like that. He sent in troops. They killed hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews. They burned the leaders, they looted the leaders, Jewish leaders' houses and burned them to the ground. As you can imagine, the Jews were not happy about this, and they complained to Nero. And Nero finally recalled Felix to answer for his conduct. Okay? I think that's a tough situation to accept. Here's the apostle is eager to go on about his ministry, and yet he is in jail through no fault of his own.
He was left there to also keep him safe, so he wasn't killed with the rest of the Jews.
It could be. We don't know all of the reasons he was left there, I'm sure, but yeah, that could very well be one of them. All right? But in jail he was, and we know that his letters to the Ephesians, the Colossians, the Philippians, were all written after his time in jail. In fact, in Philippians, there's a passage which I think grew out of this situation. It's in the 4th chapter. The apostle says, in Philippians 4, verses 11 through 13, it says, "Not that I complain of want, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and want. I can do all things in him who strengthened me." Okay, and that's the story of Paul. And so next week, we're about out of time. We are out of time. So next week, we are going to pick up with the beginning of his journey to Rome. Any final thoughts or questions about what we covered today? Okay, thank you very much.